It's never a quiet job being Minister for Rail, but since taking up the post in October 2022, Huw Merriman could be forgiven for thinking it's one of the toughest jobs in the whole of government. We met him in his private office at the Department for Transport to ask as many of the big questions that people have about our railways as we could. We cover HS2, the decision to cancel the line to Manchester, the facts about the project's rising costs and whether Network North is a genuine alternative. We talk about the thorny issue of industrial relations and ask, surely it's time that everybody started talking to each other. We discuss the real problem of confusing fares and train tickets. And we ask why rail reform and the creation of Great British Railways is taking so long. Will anything really happen before the next general election? We also ask about rail freight, new trains and decarbonisation. These are the rail issues everyone is talking about. And in this interview, we tackle them all. Head on.
Huw Merriman, member for Bexhill and Battle in East Sussex and former chair of the Transport Select Committee and now Minister for Rail and HS2. We're delighted to welcome you to Green Signals and thank you for agreeing to do this. We know your time's limited, so we'll get straight in with it and begin with HS2.
Yep.
Now, in March 2023, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "We remain completely committed to HS2. It's a significant investment in our national infrastructure." Then, at the end of June that same year, the Secretary of State for Transport, Mark Harper, whilst visiting Japan, tweeted a little video on X that said, "Japan's rail infrastructure is an exciting vision of what we can do with HS2, our very own high-speed rail network for the future. It's about connecting our regional economies and our largest cities, London, Birmingham, Manchester." And he added, "That's why, despite global inflationary pressures, we remain fully committed to building HS2. Building it shows we believe in Britain." The end of June, 3 months later, the Prime Minister announced he was cancelling everything north of Birmingham. What on earth happened in that 3 months to justify such a 180-degree about turn?
Well, thank you for having me with your first easy question. And of course, everything did change, and I will address that. But I hope you don't mind if I say the first thing is there are some amazing people working on HS2 right now. Some of them will have just put in a really heavy shift and will be listening to us. And in that sense, we'll be thinking, what have I just done? Well, actually, what they're doing is building a great railway line that will go from London to the Midlands, will double capacity, and they're doing an amazing job. There's 29,000 of them working on it. So first of all, I just want to start with the positive. We are building that railway. It's going to be a great railway once it opens. But yes, you're right, things did change.
In 3 months?
Well, what we were finding was that a third of our transport budget from this place was going onto that one railway line. And if you look at our northern cities, because obviously what we're doing now is spreading the money across the regions, particularly the North and the Midlands. You look at those cities and they've got a combined population the same size as London, but their economy is half the size. And so we feel that there's a better business case if you interconnect those northern cities as we are doing, bringing more of them into the East-West project, the Northern Powerhouse Rail. So we now see Hull, Bradford, Sheffield in. And so it's a question of diverting transport money from one project into a number of projects. And what changes is the cost was just getting greater and greater, sucking up more of the budget. And so the Prime Minister made that call.
Could we come back to cost in a minute, if we may? But just on that question of connectivity, so the single biggest revenue flow, if you like, on Britain's railways, London to Manchester. That's the number one. It's huge numbers of people. As a result of cancelling phase 2, we don't have the ability to put any more capacity in terms of train paths on the section to Manchester, north of Birmingham. So I get the point about east-west connectivity, but north-south connectivity is hugely important, and now it's been constrained.
So I accept, and actually the Network North document demonstrates that we will have to look at the capacity north of Birmingham, and by the late 2030s, it looks that it will be a challenge. So £500 million of the Network North money, so the old HS2 money, is being put into the project to look at how we can address capacity. So I do accept that. And we'll also need to look at the length of trains, for example. It's possible for us to double up the trains to 400 metres and then potentially get those up to Crewe and then split those across to Liverpool, Manchester. So we're working on what we can do to address the capacity challenge. But I'll just give you another sort of pointer on this. So Nigel correctly mentioned that my work on the Transport Select Committee. So when the Integrated Rail Plan came out, I was really supportive of the money, sort of over £90 billion worth of investment. But I was very sore for Bradford that it wasn't being included. And the challenge for Bradford when we went up there as a committee was that as you made the connectivity better between London and Manchester, not only would they not benefit, because it would still be 56 minutes for them to travel to Manchester, but they could lose their existing businesses over to Manchester. And that was a real challenge and concern for them. What we've been able to do is not only give £2 billion for their new station, which effectively is their master plan for regeneration in their city centre, but reduce the journey time now to 30 minutes. So Bradford is on the map with Network North, whereas before, under HS2, it wasn't. So we're trying to spread the resource and the investment and the benefits across the entirety of the North and Midlands rather than just one part.
Understood. I mean, we'll come back to Network North if we may in a moment, but I mean, yeah, Bradford, and it is fantastic for Bradford, but it's not Manchester and it's not Birmingham, and so there are. So you can't necessarily always have all you want.
So I accept that, but actually the challenge for Bradford is it's the youngest city in terms of its population, and it's got high levels of deprivation, massive opportunities because of the youth there. And what the team in Bradford are doing, and I work really closely with the council leader, Susan Hinchcliffe, who cross-party, we work together. That's how I try and do my business. And she's got a really great vision for what she wants to see Bradford City look like. And that new station, effectively, if you imagine what Wembley Way looks like now, that's what Bradford would look like in terms of the station and then the walk through to the city, and then releasing part of the city back over to housing where it would have been retail. So it's a great opportunity. And we know what the railway can do as a catalyst. Look at King's Cross. That's what they want. And why shouldn't they have that?
Let's just go back to costs, if we may, because the accepted narrative, if you like, in the media and government kind of, I wouldn't say promoted this, but certainly let this happen, was that costs were spiraling out of control on HS2 and the benefits were being they were dwindling. However, when the government published its full business case into HS2 back in April 2020, the costs then at 2019 prices, fair enough, was 35 billion for phase 1, 7 billion for phase 2A and 19 billion for phase 2B. So around about 71. And actually the government had sensibly given HS2 a target price for phase 1, which was a little bit higher than that. But let's just say about 71 billion. Yes, since then, big inflation, not the fault of government. We know that. But we know also that the Secretary of State said back in June 23, despite inflation, we're still pressing ahead. So anything under 71 billion is no surprise to anybody because the business case that you had published or the government had published said that. So what is it about the increases in costs since your update to Parliament in June 23 that came as a shock or a surprise? Because you knew the number was at least 71 and that was before you'd applied inflation.
So, look, I mean, the whole exercise is a fascination for me, as it should be, because we've got to learn the lessons. But also, when I chaired the Select Committee, one of the first things I did, because the Transport Select Committee for the, 6 years I'd been on it previously, we hadn't looked at HS2 because it had its own bill committee. So I brought in a 6-monthly scrutiny of HS2. And at the same time, I also put together an inquiry on transport infrastructure. Why is it always over budget, over time type question? And so as a result, I've been fascinated about the HS2 project before I came into the department. I've been a supporter of HS2 in the way that I opened off, because I do think it's a fantastic project. But there are a whole series of reasons why it just got too great in terms of its sum total. And I think you can put those down to a number of things. Some of it is actually, if I call it the cost of democracy. So if you look at the scope of HS2 now compared to where it was first proposed, it's very different with its tunnelling, its cuttings, and a lot of that has been through Parliament, MPs successfully lobbying, but it just has put the price up hugely. You talked about the construction inflation part, which is has been running at 20%, so it's been vast and COVID impacted as well. Some of the contracting has been of interest, so it's not quite a sort of cost plus level, but it's certainly not the risk and reward being with the construction entities in a way that some might have hoped. Ironically, actually, if that had been the case, then they'd have probably gone bust as a result of the 20% inflation that I'm talking about. But it's certainly the case, and we're looking at these contracts, the civils, even though we're coming towards the end of it, to see if we can renegotiate them to give a better split, so that if the company is actually delivered to time and within budget, then they can actually share those proceeds. At the moment, as the cost goes up, effectively the taxpayer continues to pay, and so on and so forth. So it's just been a very challenging project. But what I would also say, and I put this back to politicians, is that the original scope when it was put out was not as detailed as it should have been. It was never going to be deliverable at the price that the politicians back
but is it
in
fair,
Lord Adonis days said it would be.
Is it fair to say, though, because everything you described makes, it's perfectly rational, just not in 3 months between June and October when the decision was taken. So is it fair to say that whilst publicly there was commitment to it, privately there were significant concerns? Because no one can really understand how you can go from a position of absolute commitment at the end of June and it getting cancelled at the beginning of October.
No, so that is a fair point. There have been those that have been concerned about this for a longer period of time, and as a result, those concerns grew to a point where it was then a question for the department of if we wanted to do something different with the money, what projects could we do? And that's what got us to that place. But there was a lot of detail over the summer in terms of, right, okay, if we were to not go ahead, what could we do with the monies? How would we actually look at sort of switching it off in terms of the northern legs? And so that work was done by this department. And it comes down to choices. Some will agree with it, think it's the right thing to do for the reasons I've just outlined. Others will actually think when you've got a no regrets project, you should continue with it. We understand that, but the Prime Minister made his call.
Okay. I mean, just very quickly on capacity, you mentioned about capacity and 400-metre platforms, and which is a real challenge because obviously Manchester was going to get them and now it's not, so that's an issue. But I think if you take macro view, we know that north of Handsacre Junction on the West Coast Main Line, that corridor is massively constrained. It is today. And it does not take much growth. You talked about the end of the 2030s. Really, it doesn't take much growth now to become a real bottleneck. And HS2 would have helped that, particularly phase 2A. Do you think the government could have done a better job, really, of explaining that HS2 was really first and foremost about capacity? And if it had done, it would have been more widely accepted as a solution.
Well, many remark that it's called high speed 2, but it should have been high capacity 2. So that is a fair point. And again, I look back to my select committee days, and at one point it was all about speed. And of course, there will be the speed there. We're looking at journey times to Manchester, Liverpool being reduced by 25, 26 minutes. That's important. But actually, then it was all about capacity because the railways had doubled since privatisation, which of course, since that drops, and again, I think of this, my select committee days looking at it, it then came more about the fact that we are actually training up Britain's finest on a huge infrastructure project, which will actually deliver the long-term benefits, but also add to our skill set, and again, come back to all those people working on it. They will then be working on the other projects as well. So it has had a different narrative over the years as things have changed.
Richard made the comment earlier that the government allowed that narrative about speed to take root, because if you go back to Adonis's first speech in the House of Lords, it was always about capacity. But the speed thing was allowed to sort of dominate the headlines and things. And I don't think you can argue against that. In more recent times, the capacity argument has taken foremost again, but it's, to the sound of distant hooves, I think. But, Burnham and Andy Street are seeking to do something different. Why salt the earth, if you like, by lifting the safeguarding and announcing you're going to sell off land for phase 2A in particular? It's got a real whiff of spite about it somehow, Huw. And you can't hope to sell it all off before the election, so why not just pause and see how things go? Because that alignment by common consent is the best one.
So I will come to safeguarding land sales, but just the first part of your question, that's the interesting bit about the railways. It takes a long time to build them. And during that time, habits change as well. So I guess in the sense, it was all about speed because people needed to get from A to B very quickly because that was when they did their work at A or B. Now we work in a world where we can work on the train. So therefore it's not as essential because we just carry on working. And also now we've got to a point where we don't need to be on the train because we can do our work remotely. So it's just an interesting exercise that as the railway takes its time to be built, habits and sort of behaviours change and the railway has to adapt to that and the business case does as well. So I just just mention that as an aside, because I would have thought we can all sort of agree on.
We'll agree with that, but just one slight challenge on that. The one thing that's changed since even the 20 years ago when HS2 was first being conceived is a real focus on climate and the need to decarbonise. And we all do still want to travel, and we know that train, rail is a better way of doing it. So that's actually changed in arguably in HS2's favour.
Agreed. And we actually look, for me, I like my best journeys are when I cycle to my station. They get the train up, say to London, and I cycle through to here. That's what I absolutely love. That means I'm not using my car at all. So we want to encourage more of that as well. So you're right, HS2 should be a catalyst for more of what we've just described. Coming back to your point, to show that I don't ever dodge the questions, Nigel, I know it's a political tactic. So the aim for us is to lift the safeguarding almost in its entirety around Handsacre and maybe some other parts we will need to keep that in place when it works with the local leaders. But by lifting the safeguarding, you're not selling the land. So the land sales will take time to be able to be conducted. We'd like to be able to get off some of the agricultural land earlier, because if it just sits there fallow, then that would just be a waste, and it won't be good for the land either. So where we can actually turn some land back to the farming community, we'll look to do so. But the actual land sales has to be done very carefully and considerably. We have 5 tests to reach. The Critchell Down tests have to be met. Then we would look to sell it back to the original owner at the current price. And if they don't wish to purchase, then it would go back into the open market. And it's right that that takes time, because we can't flood the open market with our land, because A, it would depreciate it for the taxpayer, but B, that's not very fair on those in the local community that are also selling. So we'll do this in a considered manner. So if you take the sort of Labour challenge, which is, oh, we can't do it ourselves because the land has been sold off, that won't be the case at all. The only thing that will have changed, the safeguarding on 2A has already been lifted. That is just in place to stop anyone with their land interfering with the rights of the railway. That's been switched off, but it could be switched on if anyone wanted to do so. That's not yet occurred on 2B, but it will occur by the summer. But the land sales itself will take some time, because we want to do it properly.
Last question on HS2, because there's loads of other things we want to talk about.
Yes.
Euston.
Yes.
So by common consent, finishing HS2 phase 1 at Old Oak Common is operationally really daft. At best, you're going to get 8 trains per hour in terms of capacity, and even then it may not be reliable. We all know we need to go to Euston.
Yep.
It's now become a sort of a property scheme with a sort of a bit of a station sort of tagged on. If that property scheme can't get off the ground, will the government say, do you know what, we need it so much, Euston, forget that, we're just going to go back to building a railway station there because we need it to make the thing work?
So look, we are committed to making sure that HS2 starts and ends its journey at Euston. That will be the case.
Brilliant.
Old Oak Common, a fantastic new station, the largest new station being constructed, 14 platforms.
No argument there.
6 for HS2, 8 for the rest of the main line. It connects HS2 to Heathrow via the Elizabeth line. So Old Oak Common in its own right is fantastic, but the end start point is going to be Euston. And I'm really excited about the opportunity there. It's 60 acres, largest property development deal in the public sector in London. But what we all have to do, and that's all of us, that includes the department, is to be realistic with what can be delivered. Euston is a case study for why HS2 didn't work properly, because when it was a question of, oh, it's HS2, it's a bit like, oh, it's a wedding, then all of a sudden the price changes. And so all of us, that includes ourselves, London Underground, all the parties have to be realistic about the price. Because when the budget was set for a Euston, a price came in which was greater than budget. Then it was back to the drawing board, reduced the platform, and the price was even higher than the original bid. I mean, that just tells you everything. It's not being properly done. There will be the new HS2 station. There will also be the new Euston station, because it looks so tired and sad compared to King's Cross. There'll be a bioscience quarter there. So really looking at the sciences in the same way that digital is for King's Cross. And Lendlease are a brilliant partner to do this with, because they've done it before. And they're excited about it. So you look at Nine Elms and Battersea, £9 billion worth of investment there. If they can do it there, we can do it at Euston.
I think everybody will be mighty relieved to hear that.
And watch this space. There will be more announcements when we actually...
And that will be Euston with the adequate capacity and the grade separated approaches, because without that, you can't turn the trains around fast enough.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It will be.
Fabulous. Can we just touch briefly on Network North? You talked about it as something that had been sort of considered alongside concerns around HS2, and that's actually I suppose that's a bit of relief in a way, because there was a sense that it had sort of been cobbled together at the very last minute. But Bernadette Kelly, who's the permanent secretary, she's the accounting officer. The accounting officer is responsible to Parliament for the money. So when you read what Network North says and what she said to Dame Meg Hillier, the chair of the PAC, Network North, everything in Network North, whether it's business cases, affordability, value for money, all still has to be assessed. It's all got to be done properly. So, which is, I mean, is right. Is it fair to say then that Network North, there's an awful lot of it, a great deal of it, that is not committed yet and may not actually happen because it's got to go through that process?
So I recognise it's the reverse of the usual process. Normally, and we've got a lot of it going on with our enhancement pipeline, we have business cases and then we see if we can provide the funds if the business case stacks up. Here, the Prime Minister's put the funds down first of all and said this is a project we're going to deliver, and now we actually work on the business case. So yes, they are going to happen because it's written on the tin for Network North that we will deliver those projects that are listed. We will give this amount of money through to the devolved authorities. So it will occur, but we still go through the business planning process to make sure we can get the maximum value for money for it. So I do recognise it's the other way round, but it should give much more assurance, because normally it's all a question of we're building the business case, we'll see if we can fund it. Here we're saying we're funding it and then we do the work. So different way of doing it, but actually more guaranteed that it's going to happen because the money's down.
So the Treasury have agreed in terms of forward forecasting, comprehensive spending reviews, which of course we're basically living in a single year comprehensive spending review at the moment, that money has been, because the HS2 money was over a long period of time.
Yeah.
That money is set aside, ring fenced for Network North.
Yes, that's right. And it was interesting. Bernadette and I were before the Transport Select Committee, and we were talking about the sort of business case and how they're delivered. And they are harder to actually make the case when you look at rail projects, because what you can't take into account is the regeneration that could occur. So you look at the Jubilee line, for example, the extension to Canary Wharf had a pretty low business case. When anyone tells you now that shouldn't have taken place and it didn't lead to what you see in Canary Wharf now, that would be for the birds. And so that's why I really believe these projects will deliver. But I do recognise that the business case doesn't always tell the sort of complete and final story as to what these railway projects
Completely agree
will
with
deliver.
that. It's a real issue. If you look at the economic case for HS2, it says a lot of the agglomeration benefits, the inward investment, the clustering, they're all there. They just weren't factored into the business case because no one quite knew how to calculate them. If they had have been, I think we might have ended up with a very different HS2 story. Who knows?
Oxford-Cambridge Railway is a good example of that. I mean, the aim for Oxford-Cambridge is ultimately to deliver a workforce, for example, to Cambridge from Bedfordshire. So we can see that the house building that will go there, the workforce that Cambridge will have. If you don't have a workforce in Cambridge, you haven't got the pioneers because you haven't got the team in the lab around them. But if you look at it just in a narrow lens, it doesn't have that strong business case. But I can tell you once that's built and what it'll allow Cambridge to do to compete with Boston and the Far East, then it will be transformative.
But you said yourself you can't capture those regeneration benefits. That's mad, isn't it? Because you mentioned King's Cross earlier. I think the benefits there are something like 20 times currently the originally estimated number. So that desperately needs sorting.
Well, in a way, that helps us with our cases. I've looked at some of the new stations we've opened. They've actually got 4 times the traffic that was predicted. Oakhampton, when it was already a railway. I know you're always very hot on this, Nigel. But the expectations have been far exceeded.
And the extension with the buses out into is just fantastic.
It's a great argument for us then, because we can then argue, look at the track record.
Good, because we made that argument as well.
We're all aligned.
Look, HS2 was a capital project, though, for the long term, designed to enable massive economic wealth creation for the whole country, whether HS2 went near those everywhere else or not. So how is it realistic to say that we're diverting money from its cancellation to things like fixing potholes, which, although vital, is OPEX and it reoccurs every year? Does it not just show that local authorities are desperately underfunded and that the entire approach is just short term?
So, I mean, we could do a whole series on potholes. As an MP, I hear a lot about them, and actually it's a fair point, because it is a concern for those who use transport, being their cars, which is 88%
not OPEX,
of journeys.
It's not CapEx.
So look, a lot of the projects in terms of the road maintenance are actually CapEx rather than OPEX, but I still take the point. It's actually going into filling potholes. But look, I was talking about me cycling to my train station, and actually it's a journey which is dangerous by bike because of the amount of potholes. So they do need to be filled in. So I understand we're all railway people. I'm a railway obsessive. of course, as the Minister for Rail, I'd love to see everything in rail. But we are a government that has to respond to what our voters and residents want, and also taxpayers. They're paying their tax, and they deserve their fair share. And if you look at the amount of tax that gets paid by the motorist, 33 billion, and about 7 billion of it actually goes into the roads, then the motorist might argue that it's not getting the same deal as the railway.
Okay, but still, Network North took 36 billion out of a rail project and spent 12 billion of it on roads, roughly. I mean, that's 12 billion of the 36
with
on road schemes.
Buses as well. So yes, that's understood.
Yeah.
It's all focused on transport, but actually it's differing modes. It's just...
But a third of it on roads, effectively.
Yes, so that's right, with buses as well. So yes, that's absolutely the case. And again, the decision is made. It will be down to people to judge whether it's the right one. I've said it before, there'll be some that will be disappointed by it. There'll be others that think it's the right thing because it really will improve their area or the mode of transport that they tend to use. But we'll have to be judged on that. But we have made a decision. The Prime Minister's been bold. I'd rather actually have a plan and know where I'm going. The thing that I'm interested with Labour, and hopefully you'll have Louise or Stephen on your show, is we've said we're going to use and divert the 36 billion that would have been spent on HS2 on these projects. Yeah. What we're not sure is, are Labour going to reinstate HS2? Keir Starmer went to Manchester and said no, but they haven't also committed to the Bradford, the Hull, the North Wales, Ely, and all those projects. So at least we've been clear. Get others to be as clear, and then we'll all know where we're going.
Okay, well, look, on the question of being clear then, and maybe this might just show how some people can get a bit frustrated. I mean, you were in Dore and Totley recently.
Yes.
Which was terrific. My local station till recently was Grindleford, so that's very close to my heart. And opening up that scheme, 150 million, all brilliant. And obviously there's more to do in Manchester and Sheffield, as you quite rightly said. But you also said on the day, the upgrade of Dore and Totley and the Hope Valley is just one of hundreds of projects we're delivering as part of our Network North plan, made possible by reallocated HS2 funding. But that was a project that was funded in 2021, ages before we decided to cancel. Honestly, how can anybody really claim that 150 million, the Hope Valley, was a result of Network North and the reallocation of money from HS2?
No, so look, that was obviously not correct, because, as you say, that scheme started before Network North was born. We were there to celebrate the scheme's benefits, the passing loop, the new station, which looks amazing, I have to say.
It does look amazing.
It should have been a question of, and we will build similar projects through Network North. So if you take accessibility, and this is something I was really keen to do, and also stretch the budget, I wanted to make sure that we had enough access for all schemes in for the next phase out of the Network North money. That will be made possible, but the previous access for all stations that are being built has been from our previous commitments. So we have to communicate properly. And so I fully accept what you've just said.
And I think people will really appreciate that.
Yeah, I always try and be clear, and that is a...
How did that go out in your name then, Huw?
No, I take responsibility. Whatever goes out in my name is in my name. It should have actually said that we will be delivering similar projects such as this through Network North and that commitment. But this one is something that's been planned, built over the years before Network North was born. So I hold my hands up.
Fair enough.
Hands. Should have done better. I should have done better.
Okay, can't say fairer than that. Fares. Let's move on to fares. There's two ways you can look at fares. An exercise in yield management to extract as much cash return as possible, or a stimulus to demand to get as many people as possible to travel by train. Which of those two is the government's policy when it comes to rail fares?
Very much the latter, to try and encourage as many people to go on, but trying to balance it, because we've had a challenge in terms of inflation. The fares always tend to go up by inflation because wages tend to, etc. And certainly the costs do. But over the last 2 years, it's been lower than. So sort of effectively, you can look at it as a saving over the 2 years of 9%, because they haven't gone up by the levels of inflation, but it's still been 4.9% for the last year, which is a lot of money. So what we're trying to do is balance it between the taxpayer that is subsidising rail, because we're still at 80% of our finances post-COVID. So it used to be the case that train operations largely paid for themselves. Now the taxpayer, if you look at it on a household basis, is paying £1,500 per household over the last few years just to subsidise the services. So we're trying to balance it with the taxpayer that's funding, and also with the fare payer and the limit that they can afford, because we don't want to stop people using rail. So it's been a challenge because of inflation and because of the falling numbers in COVID. But we're still in it to build more railways so that people come. And I know where you're alluding to in terms of the sort of airline style sort of design. That's not what we're looking at. So, for example, with LNER, with their trial, there is nothing in there that says you have to actually maximise the amount that you actually get from this. It's the same as our pay-as-you-go schemes. It's about simplifying fares, but in doing so, some fares will end up increasing, others will decrease. I had this conversation with a number of MPs on pay-as-you-go. Why are all the fares going up? They're not. For many, there are more winners than there are losers. But the thing with MPs is that we don't tend to get constituents writing to us saying, thank you for reducing my fare. You only get them saying, well, hang on, I travel at this time and all of a sudden I'm paying more. That's the nature of pay-as-you-go, a London-based pricing. So we all have to be brave. That includes politicians. And I told one of the MPs this, it was off the back of an LNER question, that those same politicians ask us to simplify the fare structure. By its very definition, that means some fares will go up, some will go down. What we have to announce it as is there is no overall gain from this. It's just a question of balancing out fares. And also, I'll say with LNER, we see the sort of off-peak that comes straight after peak, where they are absolutely rammed, whereas the peak just beforehand is relatively empty. And that's no good for the passenger. So we're trying to flatten out the demand rather than make money from it.
Okay, that's almost like the universal challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
And completely understood. But there's no doubt that the fare system is still complex. It's difficult to understand. You know, I mean, I use Great Western. There are well-known. There's even the thing called the Didcot Dodge. You know, where you can do split ticketing and all this stuff. It's almost Byzantine in its complexity. Why then did GB Rail transition team drop the one thing that I think a lot of people thought this is going to fix it, which was a sort of a really single unified site that could have enabled some of that complexity to be removed? That must have been a bit of a shock.
Well, I think we've already got one very dominant player in the online market, and I think there was a concern of having another dominant player effectively replace that. And also, we wanted to allow the private sector to be able to grow retailing, and that's what I'd really like to do, is to break down the dominance so that you've actually got that better part. And that's just a question of selling the tickets. But your challenge that you rightly posed to me is actually simplifying them. We've got far too many tickets. Yeah. It's hard to access them. If you look at TVMs, the ticket machines. So for me, for example, I have a Zone 6 that I have that takes me from East Sussex up to London. Trying to buy a Zone 6 if I'm going to see my mum towards Milton Keynes, it's really difficult to actually start by a Zone 6 boundary up to Milton Keynes. So we need to simplify the ticket structure as well as actually making it possible for people to always buy the cheapest ticket. And I recognise that is a challenge. It's going to take work, but it's also going to take bravery, whoever is in this seat, because we will need to explain to people why their tickets are going up. But the important thing to do is to say, overall, we won't be taking any more from this, but we will flatten the system out so it's easier to understand, easier to purchase. And that's the work that GBR TT are doing. And I think we've only just started.
So we're all agreed that fares reform is essential. Yes. Equally, people do accept that the way tickets are sold has changed, much more digitally now. And so the role of the ticket office did indeed change. But why did you put the cart before the horse and announce you're going to close so many ticket offices before reforming fares, which would seem to have been the logical way to do it? Reform the fares and then go on to how they sold.
Yeah, look, the first thing to say...
It must have been embarrassing to have to back down from that.
Well, look, the first thing to say is that the ticket offices are remaining open. So as we chat about this and I talk about the future, I want that to be absolutely clear. They remain open. That's the decision we made. Look, when I stood up and made the point about the fact that this will actually be an enhancement for both staff and passengers, I absolutely meant it. And those would be the tests that would have to be met. So the aim was to multi-skill the staff, so that rather than just being behind glass, they could be out with the passengers, giving them information, helping them. We know passenger assist has greatly increased, so that's a good thing. And it just felt a better career. But what was quite clearly the case, once we'd looked through the designs, or indeed the independent transport regulators had, is that they were not meeting that test that I'd set. So in many instances, they were actually reducing the hours. So it meant the person wasn't actually going to be there at all, in which case that doesn't meet my test of it will be a better service for the passenger and a better role if the role isn't actually there at that time. So absolutely understand they didn't pass muster, they didn't meet the threshold and criteria we set. So that was the challenge. And in that regard, a shame, because for me, my local station, Maggie, who does an amazing job, but if we were just a bit more flexible with what Maggie could do, then when she's not selling tickets And bear in mind, it used to be 1 in 3 tickets sold through a ticket office. Now, on average, it's 1 in 10. So that tells you that we haven't got the same demand there. I just felt there was an opportunity for that person to be able to do more. And we are still working with the RTG and the RMT to see if we can still multi-skill staff. So we can still do that, but still keep the ticket office
But it wasn't
open.
just about selling tickets, was it? It was all the other services that a ticket office provides, which is why you had, I think, was the biggest negative response in public consultation ever. That must have played a part in your decision.
So I remember having this discussion for quite a long time, actually, with a distinguished former editor of a national newspaper, still a columnist who lives in the same village where I catch my train from. And I was just I was actually musing on sort of that person's views on the miners' strike, for example, and the fact that, actually you closed the mines down because we weren't actually having the same sort of level of productivity, but he might support that principle. But at the same time, what he didn't support was if the ticket office isn't being used in the same way, then you can actually make that person more efficient. And I just felt that the same principle applies, which is the railways have to modernise. And this is always a challenge because we love the railways for its past. We're going to celebrate its 200th anniversary. But so many times I just get told, oh, we can't do that because we've always done it like this for the last 40 years. Well, 40 years ago, there was no internet. People didn't behave in the way they do now. And so trying to get the railway to actually meet the way that passengers have changed their behaviours and transactions is a challenge that anyone in this seat should undertake. And I just feel there's a really great role if you multi-skill. And to your point about help, I think that you can help people much more if you are where they are. And that's, of course, what those proposals would have done. But I recognise that ship has sailed. Ticket offices will remain open. But I still hope we can actually give people a more skilled up job within that ticket office confine.
Let's move on to a different topic. Let's move on to freight.
Yes.
So you've set a 75% target to increase rail freight, which is great. That shows commitment and support. So that's really welcome. But what the rail freight industry also needs is some very practical things as well. So, for example, we know that electric locomotives are a lot better at moving freight. They're more powerful, more attractive force, if you like, from a technical point of view. It's a good thing to have electric rail freight. The problem is, currently, something like only about a fraction of the services, rail freight services, are electrically hauled, where actually the network is a higher percentage because there's bits that are missing. There's infilling, or there's the bit to London Gateway or Felixstowe. Would it not make more sense just to say, right, do you know what? We're just going to do those. There's some practical small infills. We electrify those now. That would have a transformative benefit. Why not just do that?
Yes, I am interested in those projects. I know them. There is a disparity between what Network Rail say it would cost versus industry. But in my view, the business case looks really strong.
Yeah.
And I'll come back to freight. But one of the things we did recently here, and again, it comes back from my Transport Select Committee days of wanting a rolling electrification programme, which I feel with the Network North and with the Midlands mainline electrification up to Sheffield, we are in that process now where we can say we have. But we should also be looking at a decarbonisation sort of rolling programme. So what I want to do is to look at the entire map of the network and say, right, what's right for this part of the railway? So you talk about infills. So where I am, we have the third rail, but I have diesels that run through my constituency, despite the fact that the third rail's there, because there's a slice of the network on that line near Hastings where it needs to be infilled. We haven't been able to infill it because third rail is dangerous, despite the fact that it's there for the rest of the network. So these were the challenges we had when we discussed with industry. We had the RSSB there, and they're now in a position where they will actually look anew differently at this, because you've got to look at the prize of decarbonisation as well as the challenges in terms of risks. And that's what we need to do. We also need to reduce the cost of electrification. So we have a poor record in this country, about £2.5 million per passenger kilometre for electrification. In Germany, it's been about £500,000. So how do we actually drive it so it's better? Now, I do accept the argument that the more you do, the cheaper it becomes. Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. But we've also got battery now. So you'll be aware of the Great Western trial with their battery train.
Greenford.
86 miles that did on a single charge, and it was stopping. And if you look at Oxford-Cambridge as a new railway, that's 84 miles. So question, where do we not need the expensive overheads? Because it's very difficult with our sort of Victorian railway architecture. Where can we actually look at battery? I want that map to show where we can go, because people rightly say, look, a third of the railway is is electrified. What about the rest? Actually, if you look at it, passenger journeys, it's 75%. What we've got to do is get the biggest bang for the sort of buck and for the passenger experience, so we can look to decarbonise.
So the terrific news on that is the Railway Industry Association, RIA, published a report.
They were in that room as well.
They've just published a report
about
decarbonisation, and they take your point to the next level. They say, yeah, a third's done today, but instead of putting wires up everywhere, if we use battery solution, we probably only need to electrify a further third, which is a significant saving. What they were keen to see then was the entire industry, including the Department of the Treasury, now really get involved with taking that debate on. Is that something that the department is really going to get engaged with?
In the basement of this place, around that table, we had RIA, we had authors, academics. I set the challenge. I want the academics in there, because when I was lucky enough to chair the Transport Select Committee, I was always interested in different academics, distinguished authors. You were before us a number of times, Nigel, because you've got to have different views in the room. If you've just got the system operator, then you just hear, sometimes it can be defensive. And to be fair to Network Rail, they were really open to the challenge and how we can do it differently as well, learning the past issues and where we could do better. But you also had those that were really pushing. Yeah. And actually, that's the only way you really change. Coming back to freight, because we mustn't forget it.
Nope.
The freight growth target is really important. We really push for that. The Secretary of State and I, so 75%, which is not the maximum, that's just the minimum, by 2050, 7.5% in this next control period. And you say to me, okay, well, what are we going to do? Because ultimately, it is a private sector operation, but our job is to facilitate its growth. And it's so important, not least, I can justify to the taxpayer why they are paying the £1,500 per household, even if they don't use rail to travel on, because the goods that they consume will be. So it benefits everyone. So let me give you one example of where there's exciting work going on, and I want to see more of it. And again, I've had the port operators around this table challenging them on this. Port of Southampton have put a scheme in place where effectively they add a levy onto freight that comes in. And then if you move it by rail rather than road, you get that levy back. That has seen them increase the amount of rail freight, and not just rail freight that's coming from where it would have gone across by rail, say out of Felixstowe. They can actually see switching from road to rail. And then on top of that, what we're doing is investing around Oxford Station. So we'll deliver an additional 2 paths for freight per day. So it means we can shift more out. So our job is to deliver the infrastructure to allow the private sector to come up with these opportunities and then grow rail freight. But my challenge to the other ports is, why aren't you doing this as well? And so I had them around the table here with the freight industry. So every other month, the freight industry sit down with me, because to me, everything is about passenger and freight. And we come up with ways where we can challenge Network Rail. They, of course, are now much more focused because they've got to hit that target. If you haven't got a target, then maybe other targets get met. And so I'm determined that we will grow rail freight. I've always been a huge advocate of it. We should be doing a lot more. 129 HGVs off the road for a single freight train. We need to do more of it.
Just a quick word on your infrastructure's fine. What about the energy costs? At the moment, the freight industry is selling off electric locos to Eastern Europe, and 10 are going from crew to scrap as we speak. And the word coming back from the industry is customers won't pay the uplift because the electricity is so expensive.
Look, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for rail as a whole. I mean, Network Rail uses 1% of the grid. And so as a result, the challenge is across the board, and it is a private sector operation. So we are aware of the challenges. We obviously look at the modal support grant, which actually helps to subsidise, but ultimately they are a private sector sort of led operation. So it's a challenge for them, but those prices are coming down.
Okay, industrial relations.
Yes, I thought this may come up.
Let's bite
important.
Let's bite the bullet, shall we? We're now deep into year 3 of a dispute with ASLEF, and more strikes have been announced this week. Surely it's now irrelevant who's right and who's wrong. What we do know is crucifying passenger confidence in the railway. Isn't it time that everybody started talking to each other?
Look, there's more talking than perhaps may be apparent. It is important that we talk and find a resolution. I'm positive in the sense that during the time I've been here and Mark has been Secretary of State, we've been able to take all the industrial action off the table except from the ASLEF industrial action. And I was listening to your interview with Mick Whelan. Look, I have the greatest respect for those that run the trade union movement in rail and across the board. My parents were both trade union stewards, so it's in my DNA in that sense. And we will only get there by talking. And I'm confident that we will. The big challenge is that, again, I talked about the taxpayer and being fair to the taxpayer, but also we need to reform the railways. The fact is the performance is not good enough on rail. I was listening to you talking and you were saying rather than rail reform, shouldn't we just focus the next 12 months on sorting passenger and indeed freight performance round? And that's a very fair point. And the sad thing is we're making it worse because of industrial action. But it's always poor because the working practices just need to move with the times. And so for us, we want some form of change and reform alongside the pay increase. And that to me is fair. I mean, I'll give you countless examples of where the railway just holds itself back because it's just not working in the most efficient manner.
That's fine, but it's the government often says, but it's the train operators and the rail delivery group that are in front, that it's for them to discuss with the unions, if we talk about ASLEF, to resolve this. But I suppose there's a suspicion that actually their degrees of freedom are so narrow because behind the scenes, the department's saying, no, you can't do that. You can't agree to that. You can't. How much genuine freedom do the train operators and the owning groups have to get a resolution?
So that's a fair point. Obviously, a mandate has to be provided because we're now in a situation where all the fares come through to government. We pay the costs of the train operator and their profit to run the railway, provided they perform. So as a result, we of course have to have in mind what those costs will be, and this is one aspect. But within that, the train operators then have freedoms to actually try and strike a deal. So at the moment with the RMT, that's exactly what's going on. So it was a 1-year pay deal that was given in condition for going into talks for the second year. The train operators are all discussing on a local basis with the RMT what they would actually like to bring in as reform. What works for one train operator won't work for another. It might already be in place for another. And then we will have a sort of quick look through and then, hopefully bless it, and then we can get that one completely sealed. So they do have that hand to actually negotiate, but we obviously have an interest to make sure that it's not going to cost the taxpayer more than we think is right. So it's a blend in that particular sense.
But because I think there's just a concern that it's a tourniquet so tight that they just can't do anything.
What it certainly isn't. So again, and I think you can see this by the talks that go on. Those talks go on primarily through the rail delivery group and then on to a local level, not involving us, but we sort of facilitate, we provide the mandate, but the talks go on between those parties. And in fact, I remember it was one of the mix saying, we don't talk to government because the government aren't the employer. We talk to the employers. And he's absolutely right in that regard. That does occur, but we obviously have to be mindful of what the cost is. But I do hope we'll get there because you're right, people are sick and tired of the industrial action. We've got there with all of the other unions. I do believe it's a fair increase we're looking at. I mean, it's £5,000 on top of £60,000 on average. And I heard Mick saying, my members haven't had a pay rise. Well, actually, we're offering one, but we do want some reform. But if you look at the pay between 2013 and now, a train driver's pay has gone up by 38%. Your average worker, it's gone up by 29%, and they do not earn as an average wage what a train driver earns. So we have to be fair and reasonable. That includes the unions as well.
Just on the process, a few minutes ago, you said there's more talking goes on than is maybe apparent. ASLEF say they haven't talked to you since last April or whatever it is. Is there a disconnection there between those two statements?
No, I would never make anything worse. I know how delicate these things are. I think they said they hadn't been in a room with me for a period of time. So, but look, I don't want to make anything worse. Things are sensitive. I recognise the role they have to play. But can I just give you one example to sort of throw out there? So you look at leave quota. Every other walk of life, it's a question of, can I take leave? Well, actually, you're not able to because other people are taking that leave at that time. We can't operate. Okay, fair enough. Can I take my leave here? We have leave quotas in train operators. So I gave one example of an Avanti depot, 24 train drivers, 6 at any time can take leave. And on top of that, people may have other reasons they need to take time off. That can't be refused. And then you look at a train operator and you've got a situation whereby they can actually put their leave request in 10 o'clock the night before they take the leave. A junior doctor has to give 6 weeks notice because otherwise surgery gets cancelled. And yet a train operator can't turn around and say, no, you wouldn't be able to take that leave at that time. And what that means is trains get cancelled. Another train operator, someone calls in sick, they can only be covered in the event that that person is on an overtime agreement, rest day working. For a period of time, that train operator didn't have a rest day working agreement, meaning the train gets cancelled. These aren't made up stories. These are for real. Anyone listening to this who works anywhere else will think, this is crazy. My industry doesn't work like this.
But is it not that legally the case that leave can be denied at the last minute if it would materially affect the business? So the train operator could.
No, they can't. They're not able to do so. And actually what happens is these things are baked in.
Okay.
So if you look at double tripping on Avanti, crazy situation where you cannot actually drive over the same set of rails more than once in a day, that has been in place since 1997. It actually says it's only for 5 years, but because it never got dropped, it becomes an indirect term and condition, and it would be very difficult from a court basis to change that. But why should it be the case that on Southeastern, drivers drive up and down the rails, double returns, because that's the most efficient shift pattern? If we were able to do that with Avanti, then you'd get a 15% efficiency gain there and then. Not for doing anything radically different, just being able to drive different patterns. And it's things like that that just hold the workforce back, in my view, and holds the railway back, and means we can't do as much of it as we need. So that's what we're asking, is relatively straightforward changes that most other workplaces have just innovated over time without any issue at all. And it's not a question of trying to pick on terms and conditions on train drivers. We don't have this same issue with our civil servants, with people that work for National Highways, Civil Aviation Authority, etc. It's just particular to the rail industry that hasn't modernised. You both know it well. So we're just trying to make it more efficient so we can do more with the drivers. They can do more. And then the passenger benefits or the freight benefits.
It's very clear how engaged you are with the subject. Yeah, we can see the passion. That's a good thing.
But what I should also say is I know that there have been opportunities before Mark and I came in here where it has been used as a bit of a sort of political football. I'm interested in it because I'm interested in making things better for the passenger and freight. But this isn't a political sort of point scoring. The passengers have had enough, and we have had enough as well. We want it to improve, but that's only going to occur if we work constructively with the union leaders, recognising their role, what they have to do for their members, and that we can make it a better job for them. So there's no political point scoring with what I say. I just want it to change because I think it would be best for everyone.
Okay, that's a quick word on rolling stock. It seems that the concerns of the chief executive of Alstom, Nick Crossfield at Derby, who explained in one of our interviews what had happened or rather not happened over the last 12 months in trying to get a deal sorted for Derby, it appears there's been progress, and Mark Harper's recent meeting with Alstom sounds positive. Can you confirm that the government will approve the procurement of those 10 trains that are going to be sorely needed anyway?
So there's a period of commercial due diligence going on, and it wouldn't be right for me to make that more difficult, but things are looking positive. You're right to mention Mark because he's personally led on this. I think he's had 8 meetings with Alstom and a similar number with Hitachi to find a solution. And all I'll say is I feel that we've done what we needed to do in order to actually give them the confidence. There is a challenge in train manufacturing, and a lot of it has actually in a way been the sort of, you look back at the success of it. So if you look back in 2010, we had Alstom, but we didn't have the new plants at Hitachi, which is at Newton Aycliffe, CAF at Newport, and more recently Siemens in Goole. So we now have 4 train manufacturers here, and they've come here off the back of the success of the orders. So we've had 8,000 new rolling stock vehicles manufactured in that time out of 15,600. But what that's done is brought the average age of the fleet down. So as you know, fleet can go for 35, 40 years. The average age in this country is now under 17 years. It was 21 years back in 2016. So it means that there aren't as many orders that are then going through. But we have now been able to sort of give confidence to the market that Southeastern, Transpennine, Northern, Chiltern will be in the market for tender. And so that order book can be seen. We've also encouraged the Roscoes to actually look at sort of refurb opportunities as well. So my hope is that we'll be able to spread those orders around. What we really need to do is get exporting. So I go abroad and people say, why are you going abroad when you're responsible for the railway over here? And it's actually to try and drum up support for our supply chain, our manufacturers, so that the world-class products that we deliver here get exported more. And that's what I'd like to see those plants be able to do. But positive signs. We hope that things will be in a better place. And I do credit Mark Harper on this. He has worked so hard with Alstom. He's doing so with Hitachi We have to have a fair process. The worst thing would be people say with a stroke of a pen, give one entity an order. Well, firstly, that's not fair on the other workforce there, but also legally, we know how litigious this is. Siemens took the order for HS2 trains to court, and we won on every count, but that shows we have to be very, very tight. The worst thing you do is give an order, get it wrong legally, and then the workforce go even further backwards in terms of uncertainty. So we've got to do it properly. I believe we're going to get to a good place. There's been a huge amount of work from Mark Harper to get us to that place, and I'm confident we will.
Okay, let's move on to the last lap, rail reform.
I thought this may come up as well. Yeah, rightly so.
Why is it taking so long to get from the Williams review to a draft bill? Everyone in government, everywhere else, has made great play of the fact it's a short, simple bill. Why on earth is it taking so long?
Yes, I was listening to Andrew Haynes when he responded to that exact same question. I think he said words to the effect of, where have you been for the last 3 years? And he was absolutely right in terms of what's occurred. So we've obviously had changes in Prime Minister. The bill was sort of ready to go at that point, and then everything changed. Any Prime Minister coming in, new Transport Secretary is going to want to look again. From my perspective, having been in the Transport Select Committee, and I'm really pleased they're doing the pre-legislative scrutiny, by the way, we had always been champions of rail reform, and we always got it. So I remember coming into this office when Grant Shapps had it, and he gave me the sort of copy number 2 of the Williams report, and I took it away. And of course, I would have expected progress by now. There's also the COVID years. This department was totally focused on making sure that the railways and other forms of transport were running rather than actually the reform of it. So Andrew's synopsis was absolutely right. The important thing is we're at a place now. And I know that you'll challenge me in terms of, well, why the need for pre-legislative scrutiny, just legislate on it. I think that's really important, because if we can show there's cross-party, cross-parliamentary support for this reform, then it means that it can just be oven ready, as people might say, and then ready to go through the parliamentary legislative process. So I welcome the scrutiny. I think it's really important. What I've said to industry and everyone is that, look, there might be things you want to do as well as this, but don't lose sight of the prize that's reform. And my understanding from the Select Committee reports and evidence that's come back from those operators and industry is that they're all supportive of reform. And so that's what I really hope we can build.
Quite a lot of people have said, though, that it's just Network Rail 2.0. It's Network Rail taking over, because quite logically, because where the network license sits, it sits in Network Rail. So I understand practical reasons.
Yeah.
Peter Hendy and Andrew Haynes have been very clear. No, this is not Network Rail 2.0. Absolutely not. What do you want to see change fundamentally as a result of the integrated rail body in GBR? If you said, no, these 1, 2 or 3 things have got to change, what are they?
Culture.
Right.
Culture. A real welcome to diversity of thought, idea and person. I don't think the railway properly project manages itself. That's a challenge that I've sort of felt from the May 2018 timetable, where the railway just tends to sort of rely on itself. Everyone knows each other, it'll all be fine, rather than independent project management. And I would actually look at a number of things that are on my desk right now where that just hasn't properly worked. So my hope is that we will have a brand new entity with a coming together of people, be that from this department, from Network Rail, from the other parts, the train operators, rail partners, all working together with a completely new mindset, but also then welcoming those from outside of the rail industry into the room to learn what we can do better from those other parts. And so I really hope we have a change of culture. I also hope we have a sort of change of incentives. So we have a sort of perverse system that sees the train operators working to different targets to Network Rail, sometimes actually incentivized against each other. That's no good for the passenger or freight as well. So we align all of that particular part. And then ultimately, I hope that all of that delivers performance, because we come back to it. That's the most important thing for passenger and freight.
Oh, we agree
all
with that.
Working together. And yeah, it's possible. It's happening right now. So if I look at Southeastern, if I look at the work that Ellie and Steve are doing as regional director and train operator MD, they work together, they sit together, they actually interchange as to who has the conversation about which part. There are still other parts of operations where you go to a train station, a big train station, and the train operator's in one part and Network Rail in another. So this can change right now. But what I would absolutely understand, and I didn't when I came into this job, when I chaired the Select Committee, my point was you really only need the legislation to change the contracting powers from the Secretary of State over to GBR. The rest of it is change management, crack on. But you actually need the legislation to force in people's minds that this is happening. So it acts as a stake in the ground. And then the change management part of it is actually then made easier to deliver because people know it's going on.
Surely that change needs to be accepted here as well. It seems like from what you've just said, there's a real problem with a lack of trust and that you just don't trust the rail industry to fix itself. Why is it that the DfT and Treasury always seem to feel that unless they control and grip it, it just won't work properly? The experience of the last few years is surely that instead they really need to let go.
I would completely agree with that. And look, there are some amazing people in this department. I've always thought that, but even more working here. Brilliant, brilliant policy officials. I love working with the team here. They are absolutely brilliant at what they do. But I believe that a lot of them would do a much better job and it'd be more fulfilling if they're actually with the railway at its heart. And that's what will happen with GBR. So rather than a question of, rightly from a taxpayer perspective, we have to monitor and business plan what the train operators are doing, everyone will actually be working together within that system at GBR rather than one set of people working in one place, marking another set. That's what we need to do. And we also need to get into a state where we can get those contracts out to train operators, build incentives in for longer periods than they are right now. We need to shift away from the COVID sort of years and the mindset. So I completely agree with what you've said, and that is the challenge.
So you're saying you'll tupi them out of here and into GB?
Well, so look, we have to be very careful because we're talking about where people work, etc. But the long-term aim, and that's why Alex Hines has come in here because he's done this for Scotland, is to effectively build a team up within the department that will always be here, but there'll be those in the department where their roles will move towards GBR. And that's exciting for them. And it's exciting for the railway because we'll have everyone working together, one sort of integrated rail body that brings together track and train, one set of incentives and a culture that just changes everything.
One thing that's really missing from the rail reform bill is the ORR. There's no change there. Putting safety to one side, which I completely understand is a very sensitive, delicate area. Economic regulation, we're going to end up with the same model that was set up for a fully privatized railway in the 90s. That's a missed opportunity, isn't it, in a world where we're moving toward a much more integrated and joined up railway? Why nothing on the ORR?
So I do take the point, and it's curious, and it's something that I've always found curious from my select committee days. I remember speaking to the ORR and asking whether they felt they should have the powers to regulate passenger services as well as the actual operator of the asset. And the response was almost, well, that would be an ecumenical question, and didn't want to say, yes, give me more powers. But I do accept, particularly when you now put everything into one entity, that it looks even more apparent. So I think that probably will need to be looked at again. I do accept that point.
That's fair. Very good question, May, on open access. It's stakeholders that have those open access services love them. There's no question about that. But is it really an efficient way to use limited capacity? I mean, short trains, for instance, on the East Coast, consuming valuable paths. And it doesn't fully pay its way. I know it's better than it used to be, but it still doesn't fully pay its way. So it's not an economically efficient model. And yet the government seems to be really pushing it as an idea. Is that not just going to make a congested network even more of a challenge to manage a timetable? Look at East Coast, for instance.
So, well, I think the challenges for East Coast is more actually between our existing train operators and freight than open access. I'm a huge fan of open access. If you look at East Coast, then we're actually at sort of higher levels than we were pre-COVID on that line, and it's got competition on it, which I think is superb. If you look at Hull trains, Lumo trains, they've got the best scores in terms of cancellations, 1% and 1.2%. They've got 96% passenger satisfaction, and they're not taking from LNER, actually to my point, because the whole market's growing. They're actually, in that sense, they compete themselves against aviation. So a different model. But you've now got trains serving Hull 8 times a day, used to be 1. And ultimately, all train operators, including freight, actually take from they don't pay their way entirely, because that's why we have £44.6 billion for a 5-year control period. So all of them actually don't necessarily sort of pay for what they use. But I think open access just increases competition. The other thing that's really interesting in open access is that I went up to Lumo in Newcastle. They train their drivers in the same building right next door to where their management are, which I know anyone else who doesn't work in railways think, well, big deal. But actually in the railway, that is quite a big deal. So industrial relations are better. They're not on strike. And what's really interesting is they take 8 to 10 months to train up their drivers. The industry average is 18 months. So they're doing things better. And so I want them to be in the place, LNER to be in the place. They're doing really exciting, interesting things. They just add to the mix and they drive us all forward. So we want to see more open access. And that's the challenge.
Very often it's not very carbon friendly though, is it, with diesels under the wires?
Well, ultimately, I want to see more sort of decarbonise. I was about to fall into the trap of saying electrification when we're talking about battery, albeit of course that's where it gets its charge from. So look, adding to the mix, changing the culture. They also have a much better diversity rate when it comes to women trained drivers as well. So I think that we can learn from open access, but we're not dogmatic here. We have operators that are under control here where we've had to bring them in. We have the private sector doing a fantastic job, and that includes open access and of course freight. So I want to work with them all.
Okay, last question.
Yes.
Is the reality that none of this is going to happen before the election?
So, look, it doesn't stop me. As soon as we've finished here, I'll be looking at East Coast timetabling, our Access for All programme. My work doesn't stop. I love the job. It's an amazing privilege to be in it. Who knows how long I'll be here for? There isn't much in this office, because I remember laughing with Emma, who used to run my private office, saying, we all know how these things end. I won't bring much stuff in. And that's the beauty of democracy in that particular regard. Albeit you can have too much change. I think there has been too much ministerial change. So I've loved being here for the 18 months I have been. I love working for the Prime Minister. You've heard me talk about him before, Nigel. He's a friend of mine. He has a core set of principles that I believe is what this country needs right now. And I love working with Mark Harper because he's a great boss and we all need good bosses. So who knows what will happen? We're in it to win it. I love the job and I love the railway. And we all love the railway. That's why we're here right now.
We do.
It doesn't work in the way we'd want it to, but we have the most amazing and rich tapestry of history. We'll celebrate its 200th birth in a year's time, but we need to make sure that its history doesn't stop us innovating and moving forward. And that's what I'm really passionate about. And when push comes to shove, it's all about the people, the passengers, the freight users, but the people that make the railway special, the people that work on it. And that's what we should be celebrating.
What a brilliant point to end on.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time. We've covered so much ground there. We could have talked for hours. I know we can't, but thank you so much. Huw Merriman, Minister for Rail, really appreciate you joining us on Green Signals. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
you. Really appreciate it.